Avery Lockland, and welcome to the interviewing workshop. So, if you're doing nonfiction work, you're almost certain to have to do interviews at some point. Interviews sounds like such a formal word, but the reality is that they aren't. If you've attended the speaker series, the way Eric engages with the guest speakers is like an interview. All an interview really is a one-sided conversation where one person tries to get the other person to share details. So the first thing we're going to talk about is how to prepare for interviews. Most of you will be conducting interviews via Zoom or phone because of COVID. That being said, the interview has to be recorded somehow, so just think about that. If you're meeting the subject in person, bring a device that can record audio. All of your cell phones have voice memos. If you're doing it over the phone, you can get a call recording app or software like that. Zoom lets you record calls. If you're an AV writer, audio visual, you'll want to think about using tools that will give you the highest quality video and audio possible. If not, you still want to have a recording good enough for you to understand with ease. Now, plan who you want to interview. Go into an interview with purpose. Know as much as you can about your interviewee and how they relate to your topic. We're going to have 2 interviewees today for this workshop. One of our interviewees is studying to get a master's in museum studies and has worked at Canada's largest museum. Our second interviewee is less of an expert's perspective and more a personal story. We're going to use this interview to talk about how we approach more emotional topics. This topic will be on palliative care. Once you know who you want to interview, plan out your questions. I plan like 5 to 10 core questions. These are the things I need the source to answer no matter what. The rest of my questions I think of on the fly, improvising. That allows me to be flexible and follow up on interesting tangents. If you're bad at improvising, prepare more questions, but what you don't want to do is make a script to follow because, number one, it doesn't allow you as much flexibility, and number two, you can get very easily thrown off your game if you're trying to read from a script the entire time. You need to be present mentally and physically in the interview. When you go and reach out for interviews, there are a few tips and tricks we used in journalism that can really make your life easier. When you approach people to use them for a source, you need to be crystal clear on who you are and why you're contacting them. Be upfront. You can say something like, my name is Avery, I'm writing a book on blah, 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 blah. I wanted to set up a short interview to talk about XYZ with you. Mention why you wanted to talk to them specifically. What is it that made you say, this is the person I need to talk to? Unless you're talking to a politician who will actually time you, it's a good idea to lowball the time an interview will take. It's a lot easier for someone to agree to, say, 10, 15 minutes than it is to get them to agree to 20 or 30 minutes. The best way to contact someone is directly. I always tell people the closer you can get to physically asking for an interview to their face, the better. People find it harder to say no or ignore you when you're right in front of them. The order of contact options from best to worst goes as follows. The absolute best you can do is asking for the interview face to face. Next best is, you give them a call, you talk to them on the phone, and you ask them over the phone. After that, it's leaving a message on their phone, on their inbox, or leaving a message with their secretary or their coworker. Then on the less good side is asking them via social media DMs. This might be your only option for some sources, especially younger people. And finally, the worst thing that you can do when asking for an interview is actually emailing them. Email is easy for someone to ignore. And that's assuming your message even makes it to their inbox and doesn't just get caught in the spam filter or get filtered out by their intern or whatever. So our first interview is about museums and is a bit of a peek behind the curtain. When you talk to professional sources, it is important that you familiarize yourself with their work. Get the quick synopsis of any books they've published or any papers they've published, especially if they relate to the subject you're interviewing them for. In this case, our source has written and published several essays on historical topics, so I gave them a quick read through. This source specializes in medieval history and indigenous history in 17th century Quebec. and she has handled artifacts and done tours for the Royal Ontario Museum. That makes her a valuable source. So tell us a bit about your experiences working at the Royal Ontario Museum.
Okay, so I started volunteering there. I volunteered there for a year back when I was in my second year of my undergrad. I started working in the one of the children's galleries. It was called the Discovery Gallery. But my main job was to help him finish up his final exhibit on genocides and crimes against humanity. And it was a collection developed specifically for the education department. So all the objects were set up to be handled with care and supervision by, different classes from like young children to teenagers.
So museums aren't just made for like putting stuff in a case and telling people about them. What does the RUM do with artifacts when they aren't on display or if they're not being viewed by people?
Most of the time when an object is not being displayed, it will go into storage.
Mm-hmm. So what kind of work are museums involved with outside of displaying artifacts? Like what do they do in terms of care or maintaining or study of the artifacts?
Like the display of an object is just such a small portion of the work that actually goes into a museum functioning. I mean, people don't realize all the jobs that are behind it. I mean, even like aside from object jobs, like just the administration behind it, there's so many people there. But in terms of like research and development, there's people who go on, they have tons of researchers who work with the curators there, and they go on archaeological digs. They write research papers. There's scientific studies done on some of these objects.
Ending off professional source interviews with a general question like, what do you wish everyone knew about your profession, is a good way to get their final thoughts out. So our next interview is about palliative care. When you talk to a source to get a personal story, you have to be respectful of the subject matter. This is where empathy really matters. Try to mirror the energy of the person you're interviewing. If they tell you something sad, don't be like, no, don't smile, don't laugh, control yourself. You also need to be patient. Some of the subject matter can be traumatic. Start slow, ask softball questions, develop that trust. Make sure the other person understands that you're pursuing the subject with compassion. We want to learn about palliative care and what it's like. The basic information like, what's your dad sick with? How long has he been sick? These things can be improvised. You don't really need to plan out those types of questions. I feel like a lot of questions like that are very obvious things that you would ask in the natural flow of conversation. So I never plan those out. Tell me one of the funniest things you can remember from, living with him when you were a kid.
Well, my dad wasn't much of a drinker, but when he used to go out sometimes with the guys after work, very rarely, when he did, he'd have a few drinks and he'd come home and he would always be in a real happy mood. So he used to always take all his money out of his pocket and throw it on the floor and told us kids that we could have whatever we grab. So we would all scramble and grab all the money off the floor. And in the morning when he woke up and he was no longer under the influence of alcohol, he'd say, okay, you can keep all the ones and twos, but give me back the 5s, 10s, and 20s.
You mentioned, him looking back and thinking about that very fondly, now later in life. That leads me to the next big question, which is, what changed with your relationship with him when he started to get really sick?
So I realized that, I'm going to do back for them what they did for me my whole life. And I think it's only right that you take care of them. That's what happens. They age. They're elderly. He's sick. When I needed him my whole life, he was there for me. So now he needs me, so I'm there for him.
So it's like a role reversal.
It is. That's exactly what it is. It's a role reversal. He was the guy who taught me how to be a man. He taught me how to be a good husband. He taught me how to be a good father to my kids.
And
So,
that's kind of what the next thing I was going to ask about too is, now obviously, like course of nature, this is kind of the way it's supposed to happen, right? It's better, everybody should eventually lose their parents rather than lose a child. But it doesn't make it any easier, How is it? I guess this is a stupid question, but there might not even be a way to put it into words. But how does it feel like just thinking about and preparing for the end of the road here?
we don't want to outlive our children. Nobody wants to have to bury a child. They say that, that would be the worst thing you could ever want to do is bury a child. So the natural course of life is people have children, they grow old, they get sick, they pass on. Hopefully they've had a good life. Hopefully they don't suffer. But that doesn't make it any easier. And you cannot prepare. There is no preparation for what you go through during that time.
Just to wrap up, the last question I think is, what would you say to someone who was experiencing a similar end-of-life journey with their parent?
I would tell them to spend every moment they can with their parent and cherish those moments, because even though they may be short-lived, it'll be memories you'll make, and you will never ever feel afterwards like you didn't do everything you could do.
When you do an emotional interview, it's good to ask for more fun and uplifting stories after that hard final punch, because you need to wind the person back down. This was a very taxing interview. It was very emotionally draining for them to do. It brought up a lot of negative feelings inside them. So never mind as a journalist or as a professional, as a human being, you should do the right thing and try to bring their emotional energy back down to where it was before you started. So those are the basics of interviewing. Here are some final tips to help you out. Always stay in control of the interview. Make sure it's going the way you need it to. If you have a source that tends to go on and on and on and he never stops talking, don't be afraid to interrupt them. Everyone needs to take a breath, even chatterboxes. If you have a source who won't talk at all, never underestimate the value of silence. You can tell someone, go on, or can you elaborate on that, please? Or tell me more about that. But I also find that simply staying silent and looking at them expectantly is a powerful tool for making someone want to talk. Our natural inclination is to fill awkward silences. If you force one, your source might feel compelled to keep talking. So those are the basic tools to finding and conducting an interview from me to you. It honestly just comes down to practice, developing those skills. Doing the interviews is the best way to get better at them. Doing practice interviews might seem silly, but it helps a lot. So I would recommend that you do practice interviews now and then with your DE and with the other people in your writer's circle, and just get some experience in before you start approaching the sources that you really need for your books. Good luck with all of your books, and good luck with all of your interviews. Take care.